and he might have known right away, for Johannes had once told him. They had heard one of the guards put the blame for some neglect of duty to another, who had retorted that it was the fault of the third man, and Johannes had said to David, "Let me never hear you say it's someone else's fault. It often is, but you must never shirk your own responsibility. There's always some way in which you are at fault too, and you must discover that fault and learn to recognise it and take the consequence, not only because it is the honourable thing to do, but also because it's the easiest way. You can't change others, but you can do something about a fault in yourself." He had told the God plainly what the fault was. He had said God was cruel, like Carlo and the farmer and all bad people, when perhaps God just wanted to teach him where his own fault lay. He had been cruel to himself. He was not the only one who had waited patiently without complaining. Carlo had too, and David had taken no notice. Carlo had said that he was sorry several times, and David had refused to forgive him. But suppose Carlo would have to get away that night. The tunnel was twice its own length. He did not know if it were long enough, but it would have to do. He had no more time. When it was dark and the farmer and his family were at supper, David slipped out and thrust a long broomstick through the snow behind the stable, just where he reckoned the tunnel ended. Half the broomstick stuck out of the snow. That meant he would be able to get through that night, but it also meant that if the farmer spotted the stick, he would undoubtedly guess what David was up to. David waited with beating heart for the farmer's footsteps when he came to bar the door. Would he take a walk round now, that it was no longer snowing? But the farmer went straight in again. It was still very cold out. David fought down his own feeling of nausea. He always felt sick when he was most frightened. But that night he had no time to stop. He wouldn't be sick. But he was in spite of that. The dog was uneasy that evening. First it lay watching him as he worked at the tunnel, its eyes shining in the dark, and then it tried to help him with the digging, trotting backwards and forwards and scrabbling in the snow, just where David was going to put the bucket. After a while, it got the idea of placing both its footprints on the bucket and pushing so that it would fit into the snow more easily. The dog whined a little now and then and followed David with his eyes while looking for his bundle and packaging his things together. Fortunately, there had been nothing in it that the farmer could find a use for. He had gone through it thoroughly and thrown it back at David. David tidied himself up as well as he could in the darkness and carefully disentangled Maria's cross, which he had tied firmly inside the belt of his trousers so that he should not lose it. As he fastened the chain around his neck, he said softly to the dog, "I must go now. Thank you for keeping me so warm at night, King, but most of all for wanting to protect me against them. I've never known what it was like before to have someone who wanted to protect me. Goodbye." He took a firm hold of the dog's thick, warm neck and laid his head against it, and King licked him enthusiastically round the chin. Then David crawled into the tunnel until he came to the hole he had made by wriggling the broomstick round. The dog followed him, but David said, "No, King, you must stay here where you get food every day. Goodbye." And so he was out in the open. It was still very, very cold, but by listening to the conversation of the farmer and his wife, he found out how to get down to the road and wound on through the mountains, and perhaps it would not be quite so cold further down now spring was on its way. It was already April. David hurried along as fast as he dared. The night was still and clear enough for him to see where he was going. An hour passed in half scrambling, half walking down to where the road should be, and then he saw it. Men had begun to clear it to make way through the snow, but it would be some time yet before a car would be able to drive along it. David could see where the road lay. However, he was able to walk without too much difficulty, and the going would soon be easier, for he knew he was up high in the neighbourhood of a pass called St. Gothard, and farther down spring would be more advanced. He looked back over his shoulder at the White Mountain. The winter had come to an end at last. Then he had his freedom once more. He was glad he had discovered the meaning of the barred door. Everything had gone smoothly since then. Yes, he had made a good choice after all when he had chosen God of the green pastures and still waters. He was very powerful, and the fact that he expected you to think for yourself and do something in return for his help did not matter, as long as you could work things out. David did not know how long he had been aware of the dark dot up in the mountainside. It was moving towards him. He was not yet free. He turned and ran. The moon was shining now. If he could reach the turn of the road where it swept round a spur of the rock, he might be able to dig himself into the snow before the farmer arrived on the scene. David never knew how he managed to do it. Everything went black in front of his eyes as he lay in the snow. Then a warm, wet feeling on his face woke him up. It was not the farmer after all. It was the dog who wanted to go with him. It trotted along by his side, sometimes running on ahead, but always returning to keep him company, and every time he spoke to it, it would always wag its tail. David breathed deeply, hardly noticing the cold bite in the air. He was David. He was free and strong. He was on the move again, but this time he knew where he was making for. There might be many difficulties ahead before he reached his goal, but difficulties could be overcome. He still had one more promise of help left over from God, and he had the dog who was going with him of his own free will. The long winter had passed, and he was going down to meet the spring. Chapter 8. The spring was beautiful. It was still cold for the first night he had to spend out, but he found a stable, and he and the dog slept close together. The next day, spring had really arrived. He had some difficulty with his money. He still had money with him from Italy, for he had earned quite a lot in Milan, and he had not spent it all before winter overtook him, and he found himself a prisoner at the farm. But when he went into a shop, he was told that his money was no good in Switzerland, and he would have to change it in the bank. He had been afraid to go in case the farmer had put the police onto him, but he had gone nonetheless, for he had to have bread, and the king was not used to being so hungry. But he had also managed to earn some money which he could use in Switzerland. He had been lucky, for he did not find it easy to get work among the Swiss. They all looked dour, as if they never laughed. Their country was very beautiful. The sun shone up upon the white snow caps of the great mountain peaks and turned them to a glowing pink. In the valleys the grass was startling green, and the houses were surrounded by trees covered in white and pink blossom. The first time David saw it, he found himself smiling. The fine, delicate blossom brought Maria to mind. A tree in full bloom was among the most beautiful of things, and David's smile came unbidden. Yes, it was good to be alive. When he had provided himself with money he could use, he bought a stamp and an envelope. The letter was not very neat, for he had written it sitting on the grass with a pad on his knee. But he could not feel easy in his mind until it was done. He did not want God to think he had forgotten the lesson of the barred door. So David wrote to Carlo. Carlo, I want you to know I'm no longer so sure you are bad. Perhaps you're only stupid. And so I'll stop hating you, because I only hate those that are evil. But if you ever use force again, I get to know about it, then I shall hate you again. Will you thank your parents for writing the letter in the paper? I saw it. And will you say I've written to you? Tell your parents and Andrea that the two little ones, and Maria. Tell Maria first, and tell her I've seen a tree full of bloom that's made me think of her. David. He wrote Carlo on the envelope, and then the children's father's full name, and the name of the town near where the house lay, and the last of all, Italy. It took him some time to find out what letterbox looked like in Switzerland, but he finally succeeded. Everything went splendidly. For a whole day, David walked along the side of the lake that lay greener than the greenest tree amongst the high mountains. David enjoyed the walk so much he did not bother with a lift, but perhaps there was another reason too, for he did feel quite at ease with the Swiss. They did not look as friendly as the Italians, and all the tourist traffic was going in the opposite direction. Railway stations, he had found, had a further advantage. There was often a map there which could he look at. He knew he had to keep north, but apart from that, he had only had a rough idea of the route he must follow. He managed to earn some money on at the station at Le Crane. He had to stop more now that he had to feed the dog. He hoped there would soon be tourists travelling northwards. He had come to a city called Berthe. It was somewhat out of his way, but he had noticed in Le Crane that the Bass lay particularly in France. The France Johannes had come from, a place called Arras, and although he wanted to get on as fast as possible, he thought he must stop to look at it. But he found he would have to cross a great river to get to France, and a frontier ran all along through it, the town. There was a road barrier, and soldiers and passports to be inspected, and so David did not go into Arras.